of Green Bellevue. Thank you, Katie, because I would have forgotten. This is why we have people who pay attention to these things. Thank you for joining us today. Kat Warner, a recent board member, recent board member, is going to introduce our program for today. So Kat, who is a student at UNL involved with all of the sustainability going on in Lincoln and throughout the state. Actually, you do things on the national level too. So Kat's busy. She's going to go ahead and get us started.
Awesome. Thank you for the intro, Michelle. I don't know why I messed up, but yeah, thank you for the intro. So to get us introduced to this topic, we're talking about fast fashion today. And so our speaker will get into this a little bit. For just a little intro, is fast fashion refers to an approach to clothing design that emphasizes getting the newest trends as quickly and as cheaply as possible. And so with that, the environmental toll is really high. And also so is the social impacts, because then a lot of the clothes that are made for us are also made from slave labor as well. And so inspired by Omaha Fashion Week that was supposed to be this week, our February event is about this topic of fast fashion and the impact it has on our water consumption and global climate change. And so our presenter for this event is Melissa, who is a doctoral student in the Department of Textiles, Merchandising, and Fashion Design at UNL. So I met her at some of the sustainability events and asked her, and then she was very willing and said yes, so I'm very appreciative of that. So she received her bachelor's in fashion design and merchandising and continued with her master's from UNL in merchandising, and was even a student designer in Omaha Fashion Week for 3 years. Now Melissa is a graduate research assistant in UNL's Office of Sustainability and also helps run and facilitate UNL's Chancellor's Environment, Sustainability, and Resilience Commission. So welcome, Melissa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. All right, should I pull up the presentation?
Yeah, whenever you're ready. You should have sharing privileges.
Yes. Right here. All right, can we see this all?
Yep, you may want to flip it though, because we can see exactly what you can see.
Okay, let me fix this. All right, how about that? How's that look? Good. All right, so today I'm just going to kind of go through some hot topics in fast fashion, kind of some environmental aspects of different textiles and fabrics, and talk about some dyeing processes and brief overview of several different things. So I'd love to answer your questions at the end, so please write them down or keep them in the back of your head. I have all kinds of great answers for you. I've taken just about every kind of course I could ever possibly take in design, manufacturing, and dyeing technology. So I'll open for questions at the end. So today I've titled this Environmental Impacts of Fast Fashion and the Fashion Industry. So traditionally, clothing uses a lot of textiles and chemical wastes. So that can include everything from pesticides, from things like cotton, lots of water to dye the clothing different colors, dye chemicals, including whatever dyes are needed to color the fabric, but also to use binders and glue and adhesives to keep those chemicals and those dyes on the clothing long term, as well as coal and gasoline for shipping, especially for our clothing that's made in Asian countries that have to travel quite far to get to us here in the Americas. and then chemical usage as well, not only on the fabric, but for the machinery to run. And then lots and lots of petroleum for not only synthetic clothing, but also for shipments, and then things like polyester bags to hold the clothing to be shipped, as well as boxes and poly bags for them to be shipped in, so that if they do get wet while on boat, they aren't damaged in shipment. So there's a great book to share with you all. It's called The True Cost, and they've even made it into a bit of a documentary series. So it's one I really recommend. It has a pretty good brief overview without being too biased towards either side necessarily. So after the oil industry, the global textile fashion industry is the largest in the world. About 1 out of every 6 people is involved to some degree. So whether that's farming for cotton, being a retail salesperson, working in a corporate office, any of those career paths. So it's really demanding on individuals. And it's even so important that if you are working in a textile mill in, say, Asia, your life expectancy is to be decreased by at least 11 years, depending on what kind of factory you're using and working in. And these factories, traditionally, these individuals will move from their hometowns kind of far into the country, not closer to the ocean as much as they used to be. They're much further inland now. And so people traditionally live at these factories kind of in a dormitory setting these days. So even though we'd love for there to be a perfect solution, it's really difficult as this industry is still really labor required. We don't have a lot of solutions yet for things that we would love to. And while research is really making huge impacts, a lot of the technology we have so far are too expensive for most small to medium manufacturers to implement. And the larger manufacturers that are often helped subsidized by, say, the Chinese government, that's a popular one, they do not generally invest in new equipment for factories once they're already built and open. So that's a huge issue. So for example, one basic cotton t-shirt using traditional methods uses 766 gallons of water to produce. That's everything from the cotton water needed to grow that crop, to shipping it, to using all of the water to dye it, to rinse it, all of that. So it's a pretty substantial amount of water for, one fairly simple item. And then cotton crop uses anywhere from 60 to 80% of the world's pesticides for just cotton. So that's a really significant impact, because pesticide control that's not well maintained can have really, really negative impacts, not only on farmers, but also people in the communities around them as it travels through water supplies. So you'll start to see individuals with a lot of health issues near farmland. So they might have health issues like upper respiratory illnesses, skin discoloration, and breathing problems oftentimes. And then as they get older, a lot of times they end up being diagnosed with cancers, lots of tumors that can't necessarily be explained to anything else in their communities. And then you do end up seeing a lot of children with neurological disabilities as well. And then polyester, even though it's a great item that many of us tend to have, it does take a really long time to break down. So think about it in terms of our styrofoams that a lot of cities are banning and trying to decrease from getting into the landfills. So polyester is quite nearly as bad. It's going to take many, many generations to break down. And even then, once it's broken down, it's not entirely gone. It's into little pieces we call microplastics. And then, as I mentioned before, clothing that's made in Asia, even though they have really great technologies that are often being improved every few years, every decade, they do have to be shipped on boats, oftentimes that are using coal. And then a lot of these manufacturing facilities as well are using coal as their main source of heating and energy. And then clothing in the United States, we try to think about, oh, great, like I'll buy clothing made from the United States, it's locally made. But a lot of times it's often made by immigrants in countries like Haiti, because if they're a US territory, they're allowed to say that it's made in the United States. Or in places like California, where there's lots of immigrants who maybe don't have great language skills to acquire better jobs, they're oftentimes taken advantage of in facilities where they usually make anywhere from $2 to $7 an hour. And then there are a lot of for-profit prisons in the United States as well. And one of the kind of jobs they can choose from, so in a way it's kind of forced labor, is sewing. And so Victoria's Secret, up until a few years ago, was known for using prison labor, so they could market it as from the United States. So here's the problem. Fast fashion used to, it just changed everything. So in traditional fashion seasons, there were two main seasons, right? There was kind of a spring, summer, and a fall, winter, and these were the two main fashion seasons. Everyone from all over the world went to these fashion shows in places like Milan, London, New York City, LA, even Japan, all kinds of the big major fashion cities across the globe. And so fast fashion really changed it from being two seasons to many seasons. So in the early 2000s, 2010s, a traditional company, say like JCPenney's or Macy's, would take anywhere from 8 months to a year and a half to produce these clothing lines, from figuring out their manufacturing supply, where they were going to be sourcing their raw materials like cotton, zippers, things like that, and then having it made, shipped, and then implemented across the country to their different retail locations. And fast fashion really has changed that from twice a year to pretty much every week in most of these companies. Some of them are every 2 or 3 weeks, depending on the company. For example, Zara, which is really popular in Europe, they own their entire supply chain system. So they own everything. They own the cotton farming fields. They own the factories that produce everything. They own all of their retail locations. They don't rent them. They own their warehouses to distribute. They have their own logistical teams that distribute everything. So they can produce an item, depending on what the item is, anywhere from 5 days to 18 days, depending on the item, from conception to actually having it in a store. So for many of their items that are very quick and trendy, for example, if there's a new trend for the middle of summer that's perhaps a yellow gingham, they can start to pop those out very quickly to meet those demands of consumers. So this is quite bad because Instagram and other social medias and our online presence especially really requires of us, psychologically especially, to have new garments and new accessories and new looks all of the time. And not only is it bad for us mentally and psychologically, it's also not feasible for the average person to have new clothing all the time, at least in a sustainability point of view. So that's really something to keep in mind, that it's not always our individual faults, but it's the pressures of our society as well. And then fast fashion really makes us want to have these new items all the time because there's always something new in these stores. It really is psychologically pushing you to want to go and see what's new, what's out there. Maybe I'll find something. Maybe you'll find something on that fashion hunt that they want you to have in their stores. So, and then another important thing is over half of all items, up to 60% of all fast fashion items, especially clothing items, are disposed of within a year of being produced. And as many as 30% of them are made and then worn one time and then gotten rid of, whether that's donated or thrown in the waste. So that's also not a great thing that we want to keep going. So that's another important aspect. And then there's a really great organization that's international. That's the Clothing for Textile Recycling. That's not quite so biased as some of them, which is good. That estimates the average American discards about 70 pounds of textiles and clothing every year. So that's things that you're outgrowing, but then also things that maybe you've worn just a few times and decide, hey, maybe it's not for you. And that also does include children's clothing that they grow out of quite quickly because they're growing. And especially for small family sizes as well, if you just have 2 kids, you're not passing down these clothings as much as people would in the past. And then the Environmental Protection Agency estimates there's a little over 11 million tons of textiles in landfills per month. So this is really a lot of it. And so while we've made huge strides to increase recycling of things like plastic bottles and plastic containers, things like yogurts come in, we really haven't made that progress with clothing yet. So to give a brief overview of what kind of the process of making a clothing item looks like. So you're first going to start with gathering raw materials. So that's everything from like cotton, or if you're making something out of polyester or bamboo, that's gathering those materials, those chemicals, and then sourcing them to the factory. So the factory is going to take all those materials and their laborers and start processing them in their assembly machines. And I have some diagrams of different types of manufacturing a little bit later in the presentation. And then here we get to that really laborious process. And so since we are having so many different kinds of clothing items, different styles with different pattern requirements and many different sizes, right? Because we're really pushing to have a lot more plus size inclusivity in fashion. So we're having an average of about 25 different sizes that we're making for every clothing item. So that makes it really hard for something like this to be made with robots or machinery that could really decrease the labor on humans, because these are changing so often. Having to reprogram the technology to do that is really difficult. But we have made strides in doing things like using laser cutters to cut out 200 items all in a stack all at once. So we really are still kind of in the traditional aspect of women slaving over sewing machines to still to today, over 100 years later, when we think about the Industrial Revolution and where we've kind of started from. And then in most aspects, it does get sent on a boat because that's the generally cheapest way to ship things into our warehouses that are then distributed to retail areas and then onto online sales. But in the last, I'd say, decade or so, having air flight from China and other Asian countries to the Americas and Europe is a lot more common for shipping items due to a lot of environmental changes with a lot more things like hurricanes and monsoons. It's even known in countries like India and Bangladesh, where monsoon season is really prominent, that everything kind of shuts down for a while. So that really affects the trade for several weeks as well. especially when a lot of these manufacturing facilities are really far inland. So it takes a long journey for them to get closer to the sea so they can be sent out. And then, of course, we get to where you're purchasing the item, wearing it, re-wearing it, washing it. Perhaps you exchange it with friends, things like that. And then it can either go one of two ways, depending on the item and the choice the consumer makes, whether it goes to disposal, whether that's being incinerated or to a landfill, or whether that item goes back to recycling or some sort of resale store or upcycled, whatever it might be. So as we all know, the population growth is really on the increase. So you can see how here it's just over 1,000, and by about 2030, 2035, it will have doubled. So in just about 25 years, the demand for clothing is going to be doubled. And so that really is an issue because we can't keep up with that sustainably, but also with everything else that's needed, with the amount of cotton that will be required to be grown for that, and then everything else, including dyes, chemical usage, and then other things that are more limited, like our human labor costs. So you've all probably heard of these different generational demographics, Gen Z, millennials, baby boomers, or many times people bashing on the baby boomers for their worldviews and their perspectives. So this is really important. So Gen Z, which actually I'm the first year of, so as of this year, depending on birthdays, 24, 25, under, they have more buying and purchasing power than any previous generation ever. And we can't deny that this is largely due to the internet, right? So a lot of young people are on social medias, seeing what's happening in the world. They're being influenced by the desire to have lots of new looks and to really oftentimes experiment with their look as they're trying to figure out what kind of culture or subculture they want to appear to the world as. Where in the history of the United States, perhaps when I was growing up, you were taken to a mall and given a few options and you kind of chose from those options. And today with online options, really your options are limitless. So that's a huge influence as well. So they control about 40% of all US consumption. So not only is that children's clothing, that's also children having impacts on what their parents, their families, their friends are wearing. So that's a huge impact that a lot of people haven't necessarily understood yet. A lot of people are still kind of stuck on the millennials and Gen Xers at this point. So there's this old saying by these people called jobbers who kind of go around to different factories and help supply things, is you know what color is in season right now by looking at the main rivers in China and Asia. So here you can see probably some of these back here are factories. And so even 5 years ago, this was really common to see. After the manufacturers are done with the wastewater, they never really cleaned it, and they essentially just dumped it into rivers, oceans, seas, whatever. So here we have probably a red, and so it's probably dissipated a little bit into this kind of orange color here. So you can see this in a lot of the seas in China, especially. If you ever want to do something fun, go on Google Maps or Google Earth and just zoom in to big sea and ocean waves, and you can see a lot of this. So here's some traditional dyeing. So traditional dyeing uses a lot of water, like we mentioned earlier, lots of chemicals, even for simple items, something like jeans or t-shirts. So in the last few years, Levi's, which is a nice affordable brand for most people that can afford like kind of that mid-tier price point, are really making strides on making jeans less wasteful. So you can see from this diagram here, some nice illustrations that they've made. So they've really pushed not only for changing how manufacturing is done, but also for things like, hey, if you only wore these jeans for 2 or 3 hours, you know, you can probably wear them several times again before they really need to be washed, unless you're not wearing underwear, of course. So as we mentioned, the fashion industry uses a lot of water, and it not only costs a lot of water for something like a shirt, but it's even more substantial for something like jeans. So for jeans, their machinery specifically, you can imagine this drum, but much, much larger. And you have this giant ball essentially that looks like yarn, but it's fabric woven round and round and round. And they use a dye method called space dyeing for this. And so they inject the dye from the outside in. So it gets the jeans to have those nice colorings where some areas are faded and some are more strong. And so that's really popular. And so that's how those are produced and continue to be produced and demanded. A lot of fashion designers always think, oh, they'll go out of demand, but people really like their jeans. And so we've tried to do better by the fashion industry. So these jeans, this specific new line that Levi's has, so not every line of theirs, but this new line they use a special machinery that essentially uses air pressure dyeing. And so it's kind of like a fancy jet blower, and it binds those colors onto the jeans with using air pressure and binder glue. So there's very little water that has to be used. Some still has to be used to you know, kind of rinse it and get all the dyes that didn't stick onto the jeans out. But that's really made a huge improvement, and a lot of kind of medium companies, smaller ones can't really afford it yet, have started to include some of these basic technologies without messing with patents and those technologies that have been patented. So this right here on the bottom is kind of what a traditional dyeing machine might look like for kind of small to medium-sized batches of kind of normal yarns. So this is before it's woven. So these would be called for skeins. So those large bunches of yarns. So they're kind of put in here, and then in a lot of traditional factories, they'll kind of be agitated or moved around with large sticks every once in a while to make sure the dye is being even across those and gets a nice even color. And so then a lot of times it'll be in a machine like this. So you can see all of these different controls around the edges. And so they'll inject them all around into these like fabric rolls essentially. And so those will go for many hours, and then they'll go out into different machines where they're rolled, pressed, get all the extra water out, and then they'll go through other processes such as combing it, where they make it softer, burn off any pesticides or chunks of like little bits of cotton that might be stuck on there to make it nice and even and smooth, like when you see it at a fabric store. So that is generally for cottons and some polyesters and nylons as well. So another thing that doesn't get talked about as much as I kind of think it should is leather. So we're starting to see some brands like Lululemon come up with new alternatives to leather, using things like microbial enzymes or special kinds of mushroom enzyme combinations. I've even seen pineapple leather where they use kind of some of those components in pineapple stems and leaves. But traditional leather dyeing hundreds of years ago was kind of always made in these large outdoor manufacturing facilities, right? So they would have the hides brought in, they would dry them out, and then they'd go in these big, large basins with vegetable dye and natural plant roots like beet powder. I will get to that question. So they would use a lot of natural products. You could even use things like flower stems and then other wastes. Like in one of my courses, we use different kitchen seasonings to kind of get different pigments and colors. So those were traditionally what was used, and really they didn't have any too negative of impacts other than really that physical labor that was required. But today, chromium is really what's desired in most factories because it holds up for many decades. It kind of resists penetration and damage to the surface much better. And so, as I kind of mentioned earlier, areas that use things like this really have a lot of health issues. So this is a Indian man, and so you can see how this is his natural skin color here. And because he's working in these facilities where he's exposed to a lot of these chemicals and unclean water, that it's permanently damaged his skin. And then this individual also has a lot of respiratory illnesses. So lots of things that appear like colds and breathing difficulties because of this buildup in his body. So you'll see things like that, not only by people who work in factories, but also in the communities nearby, even if they're not working in this industry. So synthetics, so things like polyesters, cottons, things like that. We have the Great Garbage Patch, which you might have heard of or seen the videos of the machinery cleaning them up. So we have kind of several main ones. We have this one, which is really popular and talked about because California's proximity, and then Hawaii and some of those other island nations. And then the Western Garbage Patch, which really affects a lot of the larger Asian countries and especially their fishing industries. And then all throughout, we kind of have those areas, large areas, unfortunately, of plastic wastes, including a lot of clothing waste, especially things like swimsuits, hats, socks, and things that can easily blow away and get away from us or be lost at places like beaches. So when we think about something like wearing socks, for example, so many people wear polyester and spandex based socks. That's really what's recommended for most people, especially doing sports. And so these socks, if you ever wear, like, for example, black socks and you take them off and you see some of those little speckles left, right, from some of those little buds that have gotten off your socks and now they're stuck on your skin, right, especially from sweating. So think about when you go to take a shower or a bath, and those are then being entered into our water streams from that. And we really don't have a great way to filter those out at this point through home-based usages. We do to some degree for manufacturing facilities, but not so much for home usages. So things like that are easily entering into our streams. So when we think about not just wearing our clothing and how it's manufactured, we also have to think about care for it. So when you're washing things like sweaters, jeans, anything that has any kind of synthetic materials in it, every time it's in contact with water, it's entering the stream in some way. And it's also partially breaking it down on that microscopic level. So even if you can't necessarily see it, those are also being entered into water streams. So they've done studies through really rural, even barren areas like northern Russia, northern Canada, and they've found things like this in their water streams. So even though they're really far from populated areas, it really has already impacted the world a lot globally. And this is why you'll see a lot of people kind of try to promote factory farming for fish, because fish in the ocean, even in factory farms as well, but one of the ways they try to promote it, of course, is that their fish are clean in factory farms, because they're not eating the plastic beds openly in the ocean. But of course, that's very biased, and all fish to some degree does have plastic in it anymore, unless you're managing to get it from a really clean source. So 2017 report, this is the most recent report, since all kind of COVID stuff has messed with a lot of this data. The International Union for Conservation Nature estimated that about 35% of microplastics, those little pieces and bits, are in the ocean from laundering of clothing, so from home use, of things like polyesters. So that's also something to keep in mind that I really don't think it's talked about too much. So then the new kind of hot thing in fast fashion that gets talked about is, oh, well, you know, it's perfectly all right to buy polyesters because we're recycling them, right? So we're reusing them, we're recycling them. So this is a more sustainable way to buy polyester. And to some degree it is, but it's still not necessarily a great method. So for example, here, when a polyester is made, you start with all kinds of chemicals, right? Because it's made from petroleum, oil. And then it's kind of extruded through these little holes, right? So you get tiny little strands that look like a yarn, right? And then they're kind of heated, cooled, and then they're eventually wound and woven into what looks like fabric today. And then eventually cut, sewn, all of that. So to be recycled, essentially what they have to do is sort it by fabric type, color type, and then what they do is kind of cut them all up into tiny shreds, shred it, kind of pulp it up so that it's easy to be broken down, and then they essentially combine it as they would at the beginning stages with a lot of those chemicals again. So it has to be broken down and then reformulated. So you're not using necessarily a lot of new chemicals, but you do still have to use those chemicals to be able to break them down. And then they go through the entire process again. So they're extruded, wound, woven, all of that. So this is also important because they try to market it as kind of this indefinite way we can still have polyester but be kind of better about it. But something they don't tell you that I didn't learn until I started taking manufacturing classes was that polyester and other synthetics can only be recycled about 4 to 6 times, because it does have to go through that chemical process again. So they do get weaker every time. So if you think about, perhaps you had something and it's on their 3rd round of recycling, you might start to get small rips and tears and holes in it as that kind of increases. So we haven't really gotten to that at this point. Most things are in kind of a 1st and 2nd stage of being recycled, but I definitely think we'll start to see that once we get closer to 3, 4, 5. So that's something to keep in mind when they kind of market that as a tactic. It's definitely a better option, but still, of course, nothing's perfect. So when we're thinking about laundering and kind of what we can do just at home with what we already have without having to go buy lots of fancy new things, you can wash things on cold. So most things except for towels and things like underwear really don't need to be washed on hot or even warm cycles. So just everyday clothing, blankets, things that don't have significant dirt buildup in them really can just be washed on cold. So that saves on some energy costs, and then it also helps save on your energy bills at home as well. And then dryer sheets actually increase the flammability of clothing as well as fabric softeners. So that's why in children's clothing, a lot of times, especially pajamas, you'll see flammability warnings on their clothing to use specific laundry care needs for those items, especially for infants, due to that sensitive skin of babies. And then another option that a lot of Americans don't tend to go towards, especially in the winter, is to just hang dry things. So a lot of things actually are recommended to be hung dry, especially things that have a bit of spandex in them. So for example, women's jeans usually are all cotton and then a few percentage spandex, to kind of fit over the hips and the upper thighs. And so doing things like hanging to dry them will prevent that spandex from weakening in them, and it will kind of ensure their lifelong abilities for several years longer. And then as well as things like knitted cottons and other knitted items, a lot of times if they're dried too long, they can kind of shrink. So hanging them to dry or just even drying them for, 15 minutes until they're a bit damp, and then drying them can really have a good impact as well. And then of course, in the summer, you can always hang dry things outside if you have any kind of clothing line, or even just put up a simple clothing line with clothing pins. That's always an option as long as you secure them so the wind doesn't get to them. And then there's been many studies in fashion design fields, especially, that have said if you knew how to just fix that simple little thing that broke on your item and you knew how to fix it, would you keep it? And about 60% of people said if they did know how to do a fix and it was under 30 minutes of their time and they liked the item and were going to keep it until it broke, then they would keep it. So this is really important because kind of learning how to sew and repair things is kind of a lost art, because our time is seen more valuable these days. So people will just go buy something new or donate it, right? So things like small rips and tears can often be covered with patches, even iron-on patches, not necessarily even required to do any sewing. And then things like hemming pants. There's a lot of great options for using iron-on hems that just kind of adhere to the bottom, and then you just kind of fold them up and under. And then other things like that. And then things like small holes, like in hoodies or jeans where there's lots of friction. Those can also easily be fixed with some simple hand seams and a little bit of fabric glue. So learning just like some basic fixes is really important. And actually the most important fix that most people today don't know how to do is sewing on a button. So even learning something super simple can be really impactful on your clothing. And if you have, a family or people that you take care of, that can really help extend the life of these items for us to be able to keep them. And then another thing is a lot of people will go kind of shopping as kind of a fun leisure activity, especially in today's economy when lots of things are relatively cheap, especially in fast fashion. You might go buy something cute for like a future activity of some sort, not necessarily anything targeted, just kind of for fun. And so if we're really intentional in our purchases and our actual needs, that can make a huge impact on kind of limiting overbuying and overspending. So if you actually need new items for winter, going out and purchasing a few items that you'll actually use all winter long and hopefully multiple winters long, instead of just buying things here and there all the time and then not necessarily wearing them, can have a huge impact. And then something that is starting to be more accepted now is doing a lot of like trading and swapping with family and friends, especially for children who grow out of things really quick. And then even borrowing things for special events, right? A lot of us don't go to special events too much, even after all the COVID things that have happened. So even borrowing like a nice dress or even like part of a suit can be really impactful. And then there's also options like renting or purchasing secondhand from not even just places like Goodwill, but it can also be from charity shops. And then some retailers are even starting to resale some of their items. So that's making a huge impact as well to start to try to normalize, it's not just dirty clothing that no one wants. It's still great quality that has good life in it, and that can be utilized for much longer. And then utilizing a capsule wardrobe or having, options that can be mixed and matched easily can also make a really good impact on things. And then you've all probably heard of greenwashing. It's not exclusive to retail and fashion. A lot of times it gets kind of thrown around in environmental protection groups and things like that, a lot of these companies are not actually doing anything. They're kind of just covering things up and trying to make it look better. So a lot of the times it's just a marketing tactic. So, they'll say things like, well, bamboo is one of the fastest growing plants in the world, which is absolutely true. It's really fast growing. But then kind of the opposite side of that, what they don't tell you is because bamboo is so hard and structured, it requires a lot of chemicals to break down those structures to turn it into something soft that people want to wear right up against their body. And so there are a lot of negative consequences to things like that, there's always kind of a flip side that, they don't necessarily tell you. And then a jobber that works primarily in China and a bunch of other Asian countries told me that there's starting to be plastic bottle manufacturing facilities pop up throughout Asia. But these actually aren't taking in bottles that have already been used. What they're doing is making these bottles at these facilities, and then right next door is, a place that uses recycled polyester. So, they're really pulling the marketing strings on that one. And that's not every company. It's just been, a handful of places, but they are large sites and they are having an impact artificially, and that's not great. So having a lot of transparency with brands is really important so that we don't cover up things like this. And then kind of as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of clothing companies, fast fashion companies that claim that they're, kind of sustainable because they're starting to use, maybe it's organic cotton, or maybe they allow the women in their facilities to get some sort of management training or something like that. But they are still using a lot of their traditional practices, just, slightly better. So even though they are sometimes a bit better, a lot of times they are just greenwashing because they're still using a lot of the same factories and suppliers many of the times. So traditionally, you would have lots of items shipped a few months before the season would start. So, winter items would come, maybe September or so, so people can buy it before actual winter comes around, get those transitional fall items in. And so by the end of the season, not everything would be sold out, right? They'd have their sales, try to get everything out sold that they could, but there's never all of it sold. Usually there's, certain sizes that not a lot of people buy, or certain colors that didn't end up being popular that they hoped would, or certain styles that, maybe just weren't popular in a certain region, things like that. So these are called dead stock items. So they're items that are considered past season and they're no longer kind of seen as valuable for retail stores to have, since they're no longer fitting in with the season, and they probably aren't going to make much money on it compared to current season. So what they used to do is they used to sell it off to places, usually sold by the pound at quite a bit of a discount, but still making some money, to outlet and discount stores, such as places like TJ Maxx, and then even secondhand shops that are, medium to higher end. And then, you hear about things like sample sales in New York City and things like that. But we really went away from that. Companies a lot of times will just destroy items after seasons now, because it's not worth the logistical costs of shipping, especially in these high costs of shipping these days. So a lot of companies that own outlet stores and discount stores now don't even use these dead stock items. A lot of times they just have companies private label manufacture certain lines just for these companies. So if you ever go into somewhere like TJ Maxx, you'll see a lot of the same brand labels again and again. And that's because they're having these made private labelly specifically for these stores. And then from time to time, you still will see some of these like mid to medium high level cost items like Banana Republic and things like that in places like TJ Maxx still. So there's a bit of a mixture, but it's still mostly private label these days. So when they say it's a discount store, it is, but only because they're using cheaper manufacturing techniques. So this is something kind of popular with younger people these days, especially with kind of gender neutral clothing and non-binary clothing, because it's a bit more boxy in shape. So this is kind of a traditional look of a pattern on a piece of fabric to be cut out. So you'll see, you have all these different shapes that you have to accommodate for in people's bodies with all the, lumps and bumps. And so you have a lot of these extra spaces here, right? And, like some spaces like this, it's really small. You wouldn't be able to do a whole lot with it. So a lot of these extra spaces, they just end up getting discarded and a lot of times thrown away. And some places do save them and make smaller things like pockets and stuff out of them, but a lot of times it's thrown away. So something still relatively new, because we have people to be able to do the research work on this, is zero or minimal waste design. So you can see this is a rectangle of fabric and it's this jacket. And so everything is connected everywhere. So this piece next to this piece next to this piece, there's no gaps in it. So they're not wasting anything like they are over here. So this entire piece of fabric would be used to make this jacket. And then you would use certain seaming techniques to kind of overlap things and cut at corners so that the item would still bend, and you could still easily move your arms and everything like that. So that's something relatively new that are mostly just used for jackets and things like tote bags at this point. But we are starting to see it in some dresses, which is good. I'm not sure that we'll ever really be able to see it in something like jeans, because we do have to accommodate for, rear ends and calf muscles and all of that. But it's definitely making some headway in a lot of companies. So that's really great to reduce waste and also not to just throw it in the landfills as well. And then, of course, the hot topic of slave labor and child labor. So a lot of times we think about wanting to buy things that are ethically certified or fair trade certified. And a lot of times those are really great certifications to look out for, especially if they're a larger company. But just because an item doesn't have those certifications doesn't necessarily it's made poorly or in a bad way or with slave labor. So for example, in Peru, they're really known for making knitted cottons. And a lot of the factories there are small to medium-sized factories. They're family run, and they're not producing 100,000 items a week. They're producing 5 to 10,000 maybe a week, every 2 weeks, right? So these certifications can be really expensive because they have to have someone sent out from these agencies to kind of look over all of your manufacturing, examine your accounting books to make sure people are getting paid, and then they go through like your sourcing books also to see, where you're getting things from, make sure it's not a farm that's using forced labor to pick cotton and things like that. So something really to look out for mainly is quality, because in especially slave labor factories, the kind of facility managers or owners, depending on the factory, are really pushing mainly these women to push out these items very quickly. So sometimes you'll see videos of a woman behind a machine and they're going whoop, 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 new item each time. And then, they're going to the person next to them to do the next step. And it's kind of, like a chain process. Like if you think about car manufacturing, it's kind of the same thing. So, if you've ever went to a fast fashion store and seen like little threads hanging out, or maybe some of the stitching, some of them are longer than others. So that can kind of be an indicator of some of that fast-paced work that's kind of required of them. And so, especially in larger companies, fair trade is a great one to look for. And then one of my favorites is Bluesign. So that primarily is for accessory items, for things like backpacks and canvas bags. So those specifically are made with using limited chemical usages, and then limited chemicals in the manufacturing facilities to power the manufacturing equipment. So it's a lot safer, not only for you as a consumer, it's also safer for those individuals working there. So my backpack actually is a Burton backpack. You can see it here. And so this is Bluesign certified. So it's been made pretty ethically with what we can do in these factories. And it also ensures that the people in these countries are getting paid at least the minimum wage in their country, which is actually really important since a lot of people have their passports taken away and they're essentially treated as slaves and never get paid. So even something as small as that can make a huge impact. And then something else that doesn't get talked about a lot is child labor. So in a lot of countries, especially really poor countries, and especially for girls as they're growing up, once you kind of hit the age where you're no longer required to go to school, a lot of times your parents will pull you out of school because they really need their children to help with the family costs of just living. And so a lot of times these kids' options kind of are to either go into manufacturing with their parents, or to oftentimes go into the forced sex trades. And so even though it's not a great option to be going into these manufacturing facilities with 13, 15-year-olds, we really need to try to look out for not necessarily banning child labor, but making sure that the labor that is required of them is at least safer, and we have like better health options for them, so they're not breathing in all of those chemical fumes and lots of little bits of yarn floating around in the air, and making sure that they still are getting some sort of education, even if it is some sort of managerial training or technical trade, because most of the people that work in sewing shops do not get any actual training beyond the step that they specifically are working on. So for many years, you might be ironing pants and that's all you do, right? So most newer factories that are trying to implement things are trying to, give people the options of maybe what areas they want to work in, or moving people from different step to step every once in a while, so they're not, at least getting bored with doing repeated steps every day. And then holding meetings with these factory workers with things like that maybe could be improved with not only the garments, but like safety concerns. So things like that can really make a huge impact on their quality of life, even if they still have limited options for work. And then another thing we often think about is, we'll just get rid of whatever doesn't fit us anymore and donate it somewhere, oftentimes to somewhere like Goodwill or the Salvation Army. And so a lot of times, you go into these stores and you see a lot of things that, you just wouldn't buy, right? Like an old t-shirt that maybe has holes in it or something, because a lot of times, you're wanting to look for something that you can buy and wear, for a while. So a lot of these clothing items end up going unsold. And so because there's so many new items coming into these facilities, these donation centers, they have to get rid of the old ones after a while. So that's why you'll see things like sale tags or those colored tags that after an item's been there for however many days, they're discounting it to hope to get rid of it before they have to get entirely rid of it. So some of these just end up going to the landfill, but a lot of them, even up until today, but a little bit less so, are being resold to a lot of African markets. So they'll come in containers like this, often at times a lot bigger than this. And they're just in these large bundles, they're not sorted or anything. And what they do is just cut them open and make these big, large open market piles of clothing. And so people in these countries will go through and buy, whatever. And so that's how we'll see a lot of African immigrants, especially really common with knowing a lot of our fashion brands, is because they have them over there from us. So this is a huge issue because we'll see things like these items being sold really cheaply, but then their local designers, their local retail shops, a lot of their traditional ethnic clothing is more expensive. And so that actually can cause collapses of their local markets, and not only of, designers, but also people who work in those shops or people who have been tailors their entire life and don't have any other kind of skills that they, can be retrained easily for some other kind of job. And so that can be really devastating on these different areas. And so some of these African markets are starting to ban imported secondhand clothing because of this. So instead of trying to donate it to a mass donation center, try to donate to places that, has a lot of need. So somewhere like an emergency shelter or emergency food pantries, domestic violence shelters, where people oftentimes end up going because they don't end up having much because they're escaping something quickly. They oftentimes have really great need. And then schools a lot of times will give clothing to children whose family don't have a lot of means, especially winter clothing. So that's really a great place to donate to, even if it's not seen. A lot of, school nurses, teachers, counselors will keep kind of small stockpiles of those to give to kids. And then foster care is another one. And not just children, but a lot of teens are really in need of clothing as well, because a lot of foster care systems aren't great. So these kids really put on, a lot of weight. So they're needing adult sizes, not necessarily just kid sizes. And then I'm sure you've all heard of Tom's shoes, kind of those little flat, simple shoes that are really common with women and even men and children nowadays. But they had for many years this campaign that was really popular. It was buy one pair of shoes from us, and we'll give one pair of shoes to a child in need somewhere. And so kind of as I was mentioning on the last slide, if you're donating something for free by the thousands, everyone has them, right? And so a local shoe company, how can they compete with free, right? They can't. And so this movement actually has been stopped by Tom's, and they've replaced it with instead donating money to local retailers, local charities to buy them from their local economies and then donate them. But I mean, can you imagine 10 million pairs of shoes? How much of an impact that had, right? And so a lot of companies you'll see now, instead of donating items, they'll do something like donating money to a local food bank or donating money to local charities to help people start small businesses, things like that. So those are some really great alternatives that, people can still help charities without necessarily giving things away and kind of destroying economies. And so as we mentioned earlier, those seasons really go quick with fast fashion. So in something like Zara, it can take, and this I believe was a few years ago, so it was 15 then, I believe it's 8 days now on some items, especially for shirts, for a garment to go from, kind of inception to being in stores. And this is because Zara owns their entire supply chain. So they own everything on a logistics facility, their farming lands, everything. So they don't have middlemen to kind of have time delays like some of these larger companies have. And since a lot of their facilities are all in the kind of Spain, Turkey region in Europe, and even a bit of Northern Africa, they're really able to play on that really quick timeline because of that. And so some other ones that are a bit more common. So Uniqlo is really common in Asia, but kind of making a headway in kind of the California space. And then Forever 21 and H&M, which most people are pretty familiar with. So some of the alternative to that is slow fashion. So some companies really are promoting, that traditional 2 seasons a year, maybe 4 or 5 seasons a year, every few months, depending. And then, they'll have something called a drop. So it'll be a limited release of certain items, and once they're sold out, they're sold out. So, they're still using a lot of traditional manufacturing and sourcing techniques, but they are not trying to have a lot of extra product at the end that ends up becoming that dead stock. So that is a pretty decent alternative for a lot of these medium-sized brands that don't really have a lot of say in a global scale. That's a great way to purchase from companies that are trying to do better with what they have at this point. And then I'm sure you all heard of a lot of luxury retailers will burn their extra or damaged items to try to artificially inflate their kind of their supply chain of keeping limited numbers. So therefore, because they have limited products, they can charge essentially whatever prices they want. And a lot of these companies do have really great high quality items, but a lot of them are made in factories that, do also produce things for Target. I went to a sourcing show in Las Vegas that had a lot of manufacturers from China, and they had a sign on the wall listing all the different suppliers that they made socks for, and it included everyone from Burberry to Target, Walmart, H&M. So even though they're using the same facility, a lot of times they're using, certain brands are using higher quality items to have that better end product, but a lot of times they are the same facilities. So if you've ever looked at trendy items, a lot of the time, you know, you'll be like, oh, I think I saw that at another store. And a lot of times you probably have, because it probably was made in a really large batch and went to many different retail places. So yeah, Burnberry was trending on Twitter for quite some time. They really got the bulk of it, even though, you know, other companies are doing the exact same thing. So what's next? So when we think about the economy, we really have to be actually doing sales to support these businesses, right? Our economy can't sustain companies that aren't making profits. And so if we're trying to rethink how we're making profits in a way that's more sustainable, we have to think about either secondhand or doing more recycling. And so we've seen places like REI, which is kind of a sportswear and outdoor company, and Nordstrom, which is a large, somewhat higher end mall brand. They're starting to have small areas of their store sell their items back, and they're reselling them as secondhand, but still, you know, in great quality and everything. So they're really trying to kind of pilot these things, and it does require a lot of physical human labor to do these things, to inspect the items, give quotes to the people selling them, and then put them back on the shelves if they need to do any kind of repairs, you know, label them like used or like new, things like that, assessing them. So that is a great way that, you know, brands are trying to do better, even though to some degree it can be greenwashing for some of these companies, but a lot of them are trying to do better by this way. So personally, I am trying to do research in that aspect and that realm, because I kind of see that as a next step, because we do still have to be having sales and profit being made. So that's kind of what I'm seeing happening next, in addition to a lot more trading, bargaining with friends, and things like that. All right, so that's the end of that. I know I saw a few questions pop in the chat, so let me head over and look at those. All right. All right. Fashionable distressed jeans with tears seems like they will wear out faster, requiring faster replacement jeans. Any comments? Yes, they do wear out faster. They're definitely a trendy thing that, you know, a lot of fashion designers thought, you know, would kind of go away. But the like ripped jeans look has really stayed. So how these are made is they're placed on a table, and there's a laser that sends like a really quick laser through it, and it burns them. And then a physical person actually takes a knife or some other small razor tool and like just continues to distress them and pull on them. And even as they even have sand blasting machines. So, you know, a lot of times like knees or near the crotch will kind of have that feathering look where it's a little lighter, because the sand literally blasts on it until those jeans are distressed enough to where the color just isn't as much there. So yes, it's definitely wears out faster and not as great, but that trend is sticking around with people. So one way that some of the higher end companies kind of try to be better is putting like fabric glue or stitching around it, so that, you know, you can still kind of have that look, but if it tears, you know, it'll kind of stop there. Let's see. This question's from Kat. So it's so crazy to me that slavery is illegal in the United States, but buying items made in slave labor is not. Yes, absolutely. We get into so many politics when we get into things like that, because, you know, we're not trying to start any wars, but if we say, you know, the US bans anywhere with slave labor, you know, we're gonna have a lot of issues. And then not only that, but it would be really hard for us to actually import clothing because there is so much slavery. There's, I want to say it's about 55 million slaves around the world, and most of them are in farming and manufacturing of some sort, including clothing manufacturing. So yes, it's definitely not a great thing and something that we definitely need to be better about. And that's why a lot of companies and consumers are trying to push for transparency in the supply chain. And so that's a great way that we can kind of keep tabs on companies that are, trying to be better and offer like better facilities for people to work in and things like that. How can we know for sure that shelters are not overrunning with donations as well? Yes, Carrie. So one thing that a lot of facilities will do, shelters especially, is put things like on their website that they are really in need of. So things that are always really in need of is things like underwear, mittens, basic t-shirts, things like that, socks. So even just something as simple as calling places and being like, hey, I have a bunch of medium size fall items for women. Is that something your facilities in need right now? And they can either say yes or no. And a lot of times, shelters and different charities really work a lot together. So they might be saying, no, we just got a huge donation in, but I know whatever facility down the road could really use those right now. Or whatever facility down the road has a lot of storage and they always need those in the beginning of winter, please bring it by. So that's a great way to know about that. Some of those larger companies, it's harder to do that with because they aren't necessarily aware of everything in all of their facilities. So doing it on a local level is usually pretty good. What about home microfiber filters for washing machines? I first saw this via Sierra Club, but my husband is skeptical about installing one. So yes, there are some that exist. There's not a lot of great technologies for them yet. A lot of them are really basic kind of filters with netting and things like that you have to clean out every once in a while. Or they do have ones that kind of float in the washing machine water and they kind of pick up some things but not all of them. Those definitely do have an impact at a small like home level that you can actually do yourself. You do really have to do research about which ones can work in like your existing machines though without having to go buy a brand new fancy machine just for some filter. So having those is a good impact, and having means to be able to do that is awesome if you can. I definitely recommend it. Just make sure that those get cleaned out every once in a while, just as a lint filter, because it can cause buildup and things. I didn't mention natural colored cottons. If people are aware of them and want to purchase clothing that does not need dyes, it could become a trend that is more sustainable. The company working and selling naturally colored cottons has developed them to not need pesticides. Yes, absolutely. So a lot of naturally colored cottons are things like browns, dark greens, kind of a dark rusty red colors, some like kind of gray beige colors. So those are really great for basic items like things like sweaters that you'll kind of always want neutral colors. But the issue is natural colored cottons is still not a huge industry. Sourcing them for substantial quantities for large companies is pretty difficult still. A lot of people that are farming in India are switching from pesticide cotton to organic cotton. So that's kind of the direction they're going in. But the cotton in the United States, especially in Texas, what they're doing is Supima organic natural colored cotton. So what that means is, have you ever heard of like, luxurious Egyptian bed sheets? That's because those strands of fibers are really long And so, because they're really long, they're really soft. And so that's what they have in Texas. So those longer fibers actually end up holding up better over time because they're not, short. They're not as easy to break down. So those are really great if you have means to buy them. Yes, a lot of people aren't aware of naturally colored cottons either. That's another thing that Cotton Incorporated, which is kind of a marketing agency for cotton, is trying to push for American cotton in that sense in the South and in Texas. And yes, they have also found them that don't need pesticides. They can either use no pesticides, or some of them actually just use like natural plants to keep pesticides from invading, like marigolds and plants like that. I hope that answered your question. If not, I had another one. Great takeaways, thank you. Wash in cold water, hang dry, strong consumer awareness, buy used, reduce your consumption. I put a lot of great work into this. Thank you. Thank you, Sherry Hubbard. Really appreciate that. I have all kinds of knowledge from several years of studying this, and it's really been nice to be able to share it with people who normally wouldn't be exposed to something like this. Naturally colored cottons have had trouble from white cotton growers, preventing them from being allowed in processing plants. Yes, absolutely. Yes, they have. So, there's limited mills in the United States and in the Americas even. And so, if these companies have had these long-standing relationships with people who are trying to bleach their cotton to white, nice, fancy cotton, then these people who are trying to do these small runs of, sustainably sourced, naturally colored cottons, it's really difficult for them to get in there. Not only because they have small batches that don't require a lot of time, but because they're really being like lobbied out almost. They really get bullied. So if you remember a few years back, there was a city in Texas that banned plastic bags, but the oil and petroleum companies actually lobbied against it and got it reversed. So a lot of that does happen in the fashion industry as well. It just is kind of all under the table because it can get very political very quickly. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you. You're welcome. Do you think the fashion industry may someday hire you to clean them up? Actually, I have thought about, once I continue, once I finish my PhD here in about possibly 2.5 years, I would love to be a researcher and a professor. But a lot of universities, especially land grant universities such as University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a lot of other state schools, they have land grant mission statements. So because of their land being funded by the public and a lot of times being on Indigenous lands as well, kind of being stolen from Indigenous lands, I should say, they have kind of a requirement to the state to help small business owners and the people to put on different kinds of educational seminars and, provide their research to small businesses to try to help them out. There's one individual in my department who goes around the state, and so he has an MBA and an engineering degree. And so he goes around the state and helps people start small companies. They're small businesses, either in manufacturing, trade, and clothing and other similar industries. And so I think it would be really cool to be able to do some sort of consulting work like that every once in a while. I do know a lot of people that work in the fashion industry that have for, decades. They do a lot of consulting work for these companies because, not everyone can just go to a small rural village where a lot of these manufacturing places are and be welcomed, so people who have been going there for decades every once in a while to check out their facilities, they're already kind of welcomed in. So I think it would be great to be able to do something like that. I would love to do something like that. I definitely plan on being on several different kinds of boards in philanthropy areas if possible. But for me specifically, I am interested in a lot of work in the Middle East, in places like Pakistan, because even though they have had a lot of rights extended towards women in the last few decades, they don't have a lot of great options still for work, or even for like bargaining for better pay or better labor conditions. So that's definitely kind of an area that definitely needs help, as Asia is honestly improving really quickly. How did I get into fashion, and when did you first learn about fast fashion? Yes. So let's see. So my mother, her parents owned a children's home. And so they took in a lot of foster children and a lot of orphans and things throughout her childhood. So she always had to wear hand-me-downs because they, really couldn't afford new clothing back then. So when my mother had her children, she wanted us to always have nice new clothing for us, so we could always look nice and we didn't have to wear things with holes in them and lots of patches. And that was really a sense of pride for her. In the late 90s, early 2000s. And so growing up, I was always really into fashion because I was kind of allowed to be. And it really didn't hit me until I was in early high school about some of these negative effects, because you're kind of a child, you're kind of self-absorbed in your own self. But I also watched a lot of like historical documentaries and reading books. So for example, American Girl was one that I was really into. And so, a lot of these historical figures before the Industrial Revolution, something that young girls learned to do was knit, sew, and, go to these professional schools to become good housewives, good housewomen. And so I always found those kinds of elements interesting. And I always was interested in like how I could change things up with clothing, so I could like hike a skirt up and put a belt on it, and it'd look a bit different than if it was all the way down, or I could tie it in a knot on the corner and have a different look. So I definitely say when I was in middle school, high school, my dad started working in the oil fields in North Dakota, right on the Canadian border. And so he started learning a lot of different things about environmental regulations because he was working as a site manager for the rigs. And so anytime there was any kind of oil spill or chemical spill coming in from trucks, they had to have the environmental agencies come out and kind of inspect it, give him all kinds of paperwork and documents. And so that was something we talked about a lot of times when he came home from work, just how much like labor he had to do whenever something went wrong like that. And so it made me wonder, like, if we know clothing's being made out of things like oil, why isn't it being treated the same way as, if oil drops on the ground, how is it any different than microplastics going into the ocean? So it really started as curiosity, and then kind of this very deep dive. And then I also took a really great ecology course that was offered by my high school, by a teacher who had really great knowledge of this industry. And she really gave me a lot of resources to learn about it as well. So quite the mix of things. But yeah, and then social media has really just blown that up as well. There's so much information out there that you can learn for free now, which is awesome. Like, I've noticed things that I learned in my undergraduate times. A lot of things like I've mentioned here are starting to become kind of popular and known by common people, everyday people who aren't in this industry. And that's really important because consumer education is really expensive, and consumer education is really what changes things, because when someone puts their money to their mouth, having that purchasing power is huge. Any other last minute questions? Happy to answer anything.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. I definitely learned a lot from this presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll go ahead and put my email here if anyone ever wants to ask or send me anything. I'm happy to share it around or look into things as well.
Great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Happy to be here and share with you guys today. And hopefully you can share this across social medias, and even more people can learn.
Yeah, so this will end up on our YouTube page. So with all of our programs, and that information will be able to be found on our website too. So we really appreciate this. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Our next program is March 13th. We will have Deanna Fela from the Urban Bird and Nature Alliance sharing her story and some of her successes and challenges with us as well. So have a happy Sunday and have a great rest of your month. Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.